Welcome back to Best Love Films, the podcast that goes with bestlovefilms.com. Let's begin by acknowledging this land, the U.S. was shepherded beautifully by hundreds of generations of Native Americans before any white people showed up. We're here to thank them for that and try to get a little closer to what they were doing in terms of the good shepherding before it's all over. My name's Daniel Smith Rousey, and with me today throughout this season is Mr. Kieron Edwards.
Thank you, Daniel. It's good to be here again. It's going to be a fun season, and this particular episode is full of films that I've enjoyed for different reasons, so it'll be fun to talk about them.
Yes, that's how I feel too. I think we got 4 good ones here. They're always interesting and good, but this with 4 just sort of stood out as fascinating for different reasons. We also want to tie them together a little bit with the context in which they were made in film history and what was going on in Hollywood and beyond Hollywood at the time. Maybe this is a good moment to mention what the 4 films are. The first is called The Unknown. The second is called Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The third is called Vampyr or Vampire. I guess we could argue over how. Oh, wait, I already just mispronounced Dr. JEKYLL if we're going to go by the movie.
Oh, that's true.
And then finally, I like to think I can pronounce the 4th one correctly. The Old Dark House. Did I get that one right, Kieron, or did I screw that
I
up?
think if this were set in Germany, it would be House.
Although we're in Wales, right? Shouldn't there
Yes.
be more consonants in the names? Right.
Well, maybe that's the unspoken joke about why Boris Karloff speaks basically in consonants.
He's getting my Eastern European name. It's funny to think that this, I mean, maybe we should save this for the 4th movie, but this is his vehicle after Frankenstein. His name's all over the posters. It's like,
Oh, yeah.
huh. So this is what, I mean, because he's almost like, I don't want to say he's barely in it. Okay, let's get to that later. We're starting in the silent era and moving to the sound era. That's exciting. During this episode, I want to mention 1 or 2 little things about that. Let's start with Mr. Todd Browning. For example, Ruben Mamoulian, who I think does actually terrific work in Dr.
Yes.
Jekyll and Mr. Underrated. Thank God he's had the critical attention he deserves. People just can't help but, once they learn something about your biography, like let's say in 1915 you drove your car into a train and you were mutilated, all of a sudden people act like that's the big reason you made all your movies a certain way. Maybe that's true. I mean, it's certainly a tempting theory.
I've read that theory as well.
I'm not saying it's wrong. I feel like if we actually had Todd Browning in this room, he'd say that's a little oversimplified because he made other kinds of movies. He's best known today for Freaks, 1932's Freaks, which is a great film. I've already covered it on the podcast. Freaks is a great film, and everybody should see Freaks. If you haven't seen
Yeah, it's my favorite of his films. So
yeah, it's a great film for so many reasons. Before Browning even crashed his car, he was already a circus performer. He'd already run away with the circus. He'd already been a barker. He'd worked as a clown for Ringling Brothers. So he already knew about these sideshows. And, for him, Freaks was already kind of well-trod ground. And even before he made Freaks or The Unknown, he had made other movies that related to the circus or circus performers. He had a movie called The Show. He'd worked with Lon Chaney, over-discussed Lon Chaney, who was already known as the Man of a Thousand Faces, even before he played Quasimodo in Phantom of the Opera. Here in The Unknown, he makes the brave choice to more or less show his face, although there is a body double behind him, a real armless guy, who's not in the credits, which kind of kills me. I mean, we got his name here. It's Peter... Oh, Paul Desmuki, but sometimes called Peter Desmuki. I feel like this is a good place to give that guy credit because that guy somehow he didn't wind up in the. I don't know how MGM dropped the ball on, or maybe it's a weird MGM credit thing.
I would have thought he would have been in Freaks, but he's
Sure.
not. Although
Right.
I think there is a shot of him in the background, if I remember correctly.
In Freaks, you mean? Or
No,
in
The Unknown.
Okay.
So
at least you're saying he got a little screen time.
yes,
As
a little bit of
opposed
screen
to
time.
only working
Clearly behind the scenes, yes.
Well, behind one scene, particularly behind Lon Chaney. If you're looking for it, you could kind of tell, but it's done pretty well, I would argue. Yes, you can. If you're desperate to be like, wait, how did they do this? You can kind of get. But that said, it's done pretty well, I think. All those scenes where Lon Chaney's character is smoking and doing other things with his feet, it's done pretty well, I'd say.
Yeah, I would agree.
If you're not sitting there nitpicking, you can get lost in it. I did. I thought that was fine. Let me just mention 1 or 2 other things quickly about the production. I was going to say that Todd Browning, it was good that he met Chaney. That was a good pairing of certain kinds of creative talents because they were working on some of the same lines. Some when they met at Universal, but Thalberg kind of earned his chops at Universal when he was a very young man, in his early 20s, and moved over. When he moved to MGM, when Louis B. Mayer poached him, Chaney and Browning went with. And I mean, there's actually some fine films from the 1926 era, but The Unknown seems to be remembered the best. It's also maybe the most horrific, if that matters. They had a movie about a ventriloquist, which I wasn't able to see before the podcast, but it sounds like that was a little less horrific, a little less macabre in terms of what happens.
I couldn't find that either, or at least didn't have a chance to look at it.
Right.
So
The origins of this is just Browning saying, okay, wait, what if I lived as an armless man? What would that be like? It's not like he couldn't have thought it. He'd been in the circus. He probably either met such a person or had, I mean, they were able to find such a person who could be.
right. I guess we would want to like sort of talk about whether the difference, or is there much of a difference between the circus and the carnival?
Right.
The carnival seems to be more of an area where the actual show is much more interactive because of the various different acts and the barkers trying their best to get people directly in and out whatever shows they're in. It's not a particular sustained show where there's like a three-ring necessarily circus, right? Where everything is happening like in the center.
Oh, I see your point. But
so
is this movie though The Unknown? Are we in a carnival or a circus?
This is definitely in a circus as well, but I think also Todd Browning also spent a lot of his time in the carnival as well too.
Point. Sure.
And also the idea of, and I think we sort of can talk about that when we talk more about the film, the idea of sort of just what characters end up in a circus or a carnival and what their past lives are.
Yep. Oh, very good point. And yes, in the 20s, probably there was a little bit of crossover. I know what you mean. These lines may not have been rigidly defined at the time, but I hear what you're saying. I watched the shorter version of this, less than an hour. I guess there's a more than an hour print, so I might have missed something. I heard that.
Interesting. I watched on the Criterion channel, so that one has the more complete version there.
I watched that one. Okay, so I'll tell you what, when I summarize the plot, feel free to tell me what I'm missing or tell us later. There was a screenplay where Alonzo kills the doctor and coach.
They never shot that.
So that's interesting. I don't know why. In a way, it would have been fun to have more murders, but it's all good. I can live with fewer murders.
I think they're trying to focus more. They call it a three-hander. It does seem like the focus is really on three main characters.
And maybe you want to keep it there because otherwise it's too much. There were a lot of interesting choices. One thing I noticed was that the titles in the opening say that we're in old Madrid. And I thought, why do we even need to be in Spain at all? I guess part of it is so that Lon Chaney can wear like look like an old Spaniard, in the serapes and the hat and the, what I'm talking about? Like
they consider it, they label it a quote unquote gypsy circus, essentially.
Well, right. And maybe that plays better in Madrid. I mean, that's the other thing. Like when you're watching Freaks, it's like, are you in France? Are you in America? It depends kind of what actor is wearing what. One thing I thought is, well, so there's a scene that you're told you're in old Madrid. And then eventually the cop is asking for fingerprints. And I'm just thinking to myself, fingerprints only became a thing with J. Edgar Hoover in the early 20s. So how old is Old Madrid? 5 years old, Old Madrid? Dynamite was invented in 1890. And when you watch old Westerns set way before 1890, John Wayne's got sticks of dynamite all over. I get why the filmmakers don't give a crap and don't expect anybody to notice or care.
I think it's the care part they sort of expect also, or just it's interesting to think about when these particular tropes get introduced to particular genres and which ones are more established or become established and which ones don't. So it's interesting to consider that.
I like this name, The Unknown. I mean, of all the names, it's kind of a weird, like, they weren't going to call it Alonzo the Armless.
That was the original working title.
Right. So. But I can see why Mayer or Thalberg might have been like, let's just call it something creepy. This title works for me. It brings it into one theme that we're going to explore today, sexual frustration. That's something we see in several of these films.
Right.
And I think that The Unknown, in its own strange way, doesn't exclude that. It's almost like that's part of why Alonzo does something. I don't think he even knows himself. He's crazy enough to be like, oh, well, if I just cut my arms off, I'm going to get this woman. I mean, that's an almost unknown pathology,
Right. It is. I can't say I've read much in terms of medical history, but I don't know if I've heard of other copycat examples necessary.
Let me do
Okay.
that. I've kind of been dancing around it a bit, and I want to give the people at least what they came for. I want to try to do these summaries a little quicker this season, and especially since I didn't see the full version, this ought to go quickly. After I finish, you're going to tell me what I missed and other things about what I missed in more ways than one. As I just said, titles say this is a true story from Old Madrid. Under the big top, we meet Antonio Zanzi and his gypsy circus as he introduces Alonso the Armless and his assistant Nanon, who also is the ringmaster's daughter, we'll learn. On a rotating, mostly exposed stage, Alonso uses his feet to fire bullets and darts at Nanon, and they land around her silhouette. We meet Malabar the Mighty, who seems to bend a barbell, followed by an offstage scene of Nanon telling Alonso not only that brute strength isn't everything, but she's sick of all the men who have been trying to paw her. At the door of her trailer, Malabar harasses Nanon, including with his arms, as Alonso watches discreetly. Nanon vocally wishes that all men lose their hands, but apologizes to Alonso when she sees him hearing her. After Alonso gives Nanon a shawl, Zanzi beats up Alonso. Malabar stops him, earning Alonso's gratitude and his surprising encouragement to seduce Nanon. Alonso's assistant, Kojo, who has dwarfism, privately removes Alonso's girdle to reveal his strapped-down arms and his two-thumbed left hand. That night, as Alonso and Kojo change trailers, Zanzi pulls down Alonso's cape and discovers Alonso's arms, which then strangle him to death. The next day, cops observe gypsies burning clothes in a post-mortem ritual as they search for Zanzi's killer, who they know to have committed other crimes. They recognize that double thumb thing. They tell Kojo to be fingerprinted while dismissing the idea for Alonso because he's armless. Alonso's playing guitar with his feet, reassuring Nanon he will always take care of her. As the circus breaks up, Malabar offers Nanon a goodbye bouquet and an unwanted embrace that Alonso watches. Afterward, Nanon forthrightly embraces and even cheek kisses Alonso, but after she leaves, Kojo warns that if that happens again, she'll feel his arms. Alonso warns Kojo that he'll stop at nothing to own Nanon. Behind a gauzy blind, I like the way they did these lenses on these shots. Privately, Malabar tells Nanon, it's a silent film. I'm going to say Nanon the way I want. He now understands her aversion to being touched, but will always be there, hoping and loving. Kojo counsels Alonso that his imagined marriage is impossible because she'll see his arms and know he's the double thumb person who murdered her father. As Alonso smokes with his feet, Kojo notes he forgot he even has arms, prompting a crazy idea, Kieron. After a threatening note at midnight in an operating room, a surgeon meets with Kojo and Alonso, the latter reminding the doctor of a mistake and presenting the new price for his ongoing silence. By an urban river, presumably in Old Madrid, Nanon has come to accept the love and touch of Malabar, but tells him they must wait for Alonso, whom she wants at their wedding. Recovered from arm removal surgery, Alonso finds Nanon working at an empty theater, well, because it's daytime, where she rejoices that now we can be married. The we being her and Malabar, who emerges, embraces Alonso, and holds Nanon in his strong arms. As Alonso laughs, Nanon becomes concerned when Alonso seems to collapse. Recovered, Alonso learns about the trick they've been rehearsing, whereby Malabar puts on wrist cuffs while two horses run on conveyor belts, pulling on Malabar's arms in opposite direction. Interesting trick. As this trick happens in front of an audience, while Nanon playfully cracks the horse's whips, Alonso uses his foot to pull a lever that causes a horse to break free and almost yank off Malabar's left arm. Nanon intercedes to stop the horse, but just as it is about to trample her, Alonso intercedes and is crushed by the horse. A title says, quote, "For Alonso, there was an end to hate called death, and for Nanon, an end to hate called love," unquote. Film ends. Kieron, what did I miss? I must have missed some good scenes here. You go ahead. Explain.
That looks actually like pretty much everything, actually. So,
okay, good.
But there are like a few different things here.
Sure.
I mean, we should actually say who Nanon is. We haven't even mentioned the actress.
Well, right, it's Joan Crawford.
It's Joan Crawford.
Is she 18 in this, I guess? Is that about?
Yeah, that's very young at this point. And when she spies the murder of her father, basically, and she's the one who actually, there's a scene where she actually sees the back of Cheney killing her dad.
Right.
And sees his thumb, his particular thumb.
Right, but she sees the double thumb, but I don't think she sees the face.
No, she doesn't see her.
That's
the main
point.
conceit. What Kojo points out is that not only will she be, let's just say, surprised that you have arms, but oh, look at your thumbs, basically.
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, the plot itself is, yeah, the plot itself is kind of pretty straightforward, sort of what somebody will do to possess somebody, essentially,
Sure. Yep.
or what they will do for one-sided love. There's a platonic love on one side, and then there's dangerously, murderously obsessive love on the other side. So,
Right. But I think what's great is that we are now entering an era where a strong actor can be the reason we think these are just as good a films as any other film. This is a time when the best films are considered like Sunrise or certain D.W. Griffith films, whatever the most prestigious films are. But the acting of Lon Chaney is so good. You're kind of buying that he would be crazy enough to cut off his arms for this woman. That big scene of him collapsing with learning everything reminds me of the Jekyll and Hyde scene that we're going to see in the next film. It's really Frederick March's almost peak as an actor when he's crying to Muriel and like, I have to let you go. But it's actually very effective. I mean, it comes through the screen. You're like, what the
right,
hell? You kind
right.
of buy it and it's good. And that's
Yeah, this
what I
is,
love
yeah,
about great horror is that it is the place where an actor can really kind of this is one of the great things about horror, I think, as a genre, is that these actors can prove themselves and really touch you in a way that maybe they couldn't in a drama like Wings. I don't know. And that's a great thing, really. And it's one of the reasons the genre is so vital. But I'm sorry, why don't you
right.
go ahead with what you were going to say?
No, I was going to add on that. You're right, in terms of horrific and or fantastic and or other scenarios. It's the strength of an actor that sells those particular scenarios,
Yes. And if you
essentially.
don't
And that's
have that, you don't have a movie, or it would seem too cheesy.
exactly. The quality of those films really rests on the strength of those performances. That's how it should be for films in general, also. I think a lot
Sure.
of it should be based on whatever characters and actors are going through and having us be absorbed by the journeys they're going on as well. So
Yep.
yeah, and that particular, it's just a kind of a master class, that particular scene that Lon Chaney goes through, essentially, where he believes there's this
Right.
wedding to go through, and then
Yeah.
he thinks it's his. And then all of a sudden, buff Kevin Kline shows up.
He looked a little bit. I see that. Yep. I saw
Yeah,
that.
so he shows up, and then
Right.
there's that. And the reaction you would expect would be just to sort of he basically can't really tamp down any of his emotions. And there is,
Right.
I'm trying to think about the history of roller coasters and how
Yeah.
prevalent they were at that point, and
Yeah.
whether that roller coaster of emotions was even a particular thing that one was described at that point in film history. But
Yeah.
the roller coaster of emotions are what we are experiencing and what he is like showing us, essentially. Just laughter and the opposite of a cry at the end
Right.
as well.
And one thing
So,
that's different, like in the case of what I feel, I mean, if we're to connect this to the four films we saw last week,
mhm,
like eh, gradually either the mutilated person or the monster, they're gradually, as these movies progress, coming closer to the lead character of the movie. Like get Hollywood, and not just Hollywood, but arguably German cinema, but other cinemas as well. They're getting more and more comfortable with like, let's just put the monster in the lead. I mean,
right.
let's trust the audience to relate to this creepy monster. That's okay.
Yeah.
You can kind of almost see that that's as the years are going by, they're like, what the hell? I mean, you could argue that Phantom of the Opera was sort of the lead. It's his name in the movie
Yes.
title, but also not. It's kind of her movie. You're kind of rooting for Raoul more. In this movie, clearly Kevin Kline is not even as present as the Raoul character. And also the same year Underworld comes out. I don't know if you're familiar with that,
I
1927.
know of it, but I have not seen it.
So it's kind of like we're getting a little bit more comfortable with the bad as the 20s progress. It's like, let's just let the bad guy be the lead. Maybe this is actually one reason that the Hays Code became a bigger thing in 1927. Hollywood is like, let's just have the bad guy be the lead. And I like that. I mean, bad guy is a strong term. I don't know
Right.
how much we're supposed to relate. Trying to relate to Alonzo the Armless is kind of like relating to Walter White or Tony Soprano, like he's bad, but we also like him for various reasons, You're right. Other thoughts about this, Kieran?
Yeah, that's interesting that you would say that for him. They definitely, with the different reveals about his backstory and everything else, they've really try to portray him as someone who's already about to go, has the monster on the inside, essentially in danger of letting out if
Yeah.
things either go a certain way or don't.
Yep.
It's interesting to see how that plays out in the film. I think you had mentioned before that Todd Browning basically had this idea of what if this particular
Right.
person is this way, and then
Yep.
built a story around that as well, which
Yeah.
is an interesting way of going about a movie. It doesn't necessarily happen that often, also.
I like it. I
Um,
mean, I'm really into it. I think it's great. It's fun. What else do the people need to know, Kieran, about this movie?
it's interesting at this point because of the different collaborations that Todd Browning had, that critics were starting to, in particular with this film, think that he was basically just a big old sadist, Todd Browning was, about his plots and everything. And there's just a lot of hyperbole in general from the critics about this
Yeah.
film, about what was going on and how it was basically just a recreation of Marquis de Sadian ideas, essentially. Other sort of hyperbole of things that they say happened in the film that didn't happen in the film. Like some critics have
Right.
accused them of seeing cannibalism in the movie, which doesn't happen. So it's interesting to see how much of a raw nerve this
Here you
scratched,
go
essentially.
again with your,
So
please bring on more arm and hand analogies. Well, hey,
so
Kieran, on the other hand,
so I don't know. It's interesting to see how that was kind of the beginning of possibly the end of Todd Browning's career in some ways,
right.
because there was a bit of a reprieve because of how successful Dracula was, that he sort of thought he might have had carte blanche to do something even more personal, which I think Freaks was
Yep.
in a way.
Yeah,
So
we talked about this on a previous podcast episode. Feel free to check out our other episode about Freaks. But yes, I think Freaks. Yeah, well, this might. I mean, I could actually sort of. Is this a good time since you're moving us into the 30s? Is it okay if I pick up where you left off and move the rest of the
sure. The
podcast?
one thing I was thinking about
Okay.
that I wish would have happened, the one thing that he could have done plot wise, then it would have been a very short movie when he was blackmailing the physician,
Yep.
essentially. First of all, I thought the physician had something to do when he said Algeria. I thought there was some sort of history between him and the physician involving some sort of a botched surgery or something.
Right.
But what he could have done, what he could have just asked him to do, maybe, if would be just to fix his thumb, essentially.
Right. I mean,
You
that
know,
the physician could have suggested that. Why don't I just do that for you?
and this will solve everything. But like I said, it would have been a shorter film.
At that point, Alonzo would have said, no, but my woman wants a man without arms, and that's what I want to do. Or so I'm relying on a Kohler piece in Senses of Cinema. That's the one I'll be putting up on the website, which also, and anyway, there's some interesting thoughts about this film. I think in general, it's just a very effective film.
I'm a
I
big
think
fan of it. So
in the United States, the Hays Code basically comes out with all these don'ts and be carefuls, and that comes out in 1927, partly in reaction to films like this and Underworld, which seem to be valorizing sin, if you will, and because they're already having, like, Hollywood's having little issues with like Catholic leagues in various cities. Basically, the Hays Code comes in. So at first in 28, 29, this code is kind of enforced and considered like a thing. As Hollywood makes its big transition into sound, the jazz singer, the promise of gangster movies, the promise of more horror movies that might have been influenced by German expressionism or is kind of nipped in the bud because we now have to make sound films. And so what are we going to do? We'll just do Broadway musicals. You have a bunch of these movies that are like Broadway blankety blank this and the melody. It's a thing, but what you don't have in these early Hays Code years is more horror, not really. Then the stock market crashes in October of 29. Hollywood has just spent all the money they had to retrofit all these theaters for sound, and then suddenly they've got all these cheesy movies that come out in 1930 and nobody wants to see them. People aren't spending their discretionary income. So it's weird these days, almost 100 years later, you look back with a broad brush and it just seems like everything was happening all at once, but it kind of, we forget what was actually happening. So 1930, Hollywood's basically like losing money hand over fist. There's not every movie's coming out. They're not, other than maybe All Quiet on the Western Front. Most movies are doing really poorly. So they're like, at that point, they're like Hays Code, Schmaze Code. We don't, and this is at the same time that Carl Laemmle is negotiating to adapt the stage play of Dracula, working with Bram Stoker's widow to bring that to America, among other things. I mean, they're like, we need a hit. And you know what? At this point, we would dare the Hays Code because we don't care. If we don't come up with a hit, something's going to shut down. So basically, they're looking into whatever they can find that might do well. And one such move, I mean, one such property that Adolf Zucker and Paramount are looking at is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. They're like, okay. And by the way, they're not gonna, this thing about the Hays Code. I mean, this is why. So the Hays Code was still nominally on the books. When you go to Wikipedia these days, it'll tell you that a movie like Dr. Jekyll is pre-code. And what they mean by that is that it's after the 1927 list of don'ts and be carefuls, but it's very, very rigorously enforced before Joseph Breen really brings down the hammer and says, no, no, no more of this. Because in 31, basically in reaction, so what we now have as people who can enjoy these films now on Criterion and elsewhere is we see in 1931, suddenly we got gangster films, The Public Enemy, suddenly we got Little Caesar, suddenly we've got Dracula, because all of a sudden Hollywood is like, if we don't come up with something that people want to see, we're going to all be out of business anyway. So
Right.
Dr. Jekyll is part of that generation. And in retrospect, it's like, wait, Paramount's doing this too? Adolf Zucker, who's this straight-laced guy. That makes sense because it is based on a prestigious novel, Robert Louis Stevenson's. It's not like they just had to make up the story. When you're watching Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and you see all those like London sets and the misty, Victorian, it does, it reminds you of tales of Jack the Ripper. It feels like Dickensian London or Victoria. There's so many people in like top hats and parties. So it's the things you do associate with Paramount Pictures with like kind of prestige productions, but but on the other hand, it's also about a doctor who is going a little crazy. So Kieron, go ahead.
Well, it's also funny that you would talk about Jack the Ripper because
Right.
they adapted the novel or novella to a stage play in 1888.
Yeah.
And it was done at the Lyceum Theatre in London. Towards the end of August, there was a murder committed by a person who was later named Jack the Ripper. All of that terminated that production of the play because of its association with Jack the Ripper.
I haven't seen the 1920 movie with John Barrymore. That was an aspect of this production. They wanted to get Barrymore to redo his role. He wouldn't do it.
Exactly.
Or I guess he was under contract with MGM. Apparently, one of the reasons Paramount cast Frederick March is that he looked like John Barrymore, or they thought he did.
There was a play.
He'd
Yeah.
played John Barrymore in a version called The Royal Family of Broadway, the kind of movie that I was just talking about that they were making.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, it's something. I guess does Frederick March, did he win the first like best actor Oscar for a horror role? I gotta say it's very well deserved. I'm captivated by March in this. I think he
Yeah.
makes this movie. He's great. Nothing against John Barrymore, who couldn't help but work in the silent era. But there's something about a person speaking lines. You're going to hear when I summarize this movie. Watching March, I don't know that I've seen a better sound performance up to this point, up to 1931. Show me the better performance, Kieron. I don't know. I would go with some earlier silent performances that were probably just as good, but in terms of
Yes.
actually speaking audible lines up till 1931, I don't know. Marlene Dietrich in The Blue Angel, I don't know. I mean, this is as good as anything I've seen.
Yeah, same here. If you want to go from silent, we could also talk about another film by the director of Vampyr, where the main
Yes. Oh,
actors
yeah.
there.
Oh, God. Falconetti, please. Which is weird. And I want to get to that. The fact that this is actually Carl Dreyer's next film after that. Of all the things he
Right.
could have done, he chose to do this next. But let's get to
Yeah.
that in a minute.
The other thing too, plot-wise, if I remember correctly, the original novella doesn't have any female characters in it, or any
Right.
main female
Yes. Or no,
characters.
I think Muriel's in it, but not Ivy.
I think
Really?
Muriel actually doesn't show up until the stage production.
Oh, okay.
And then Ivy doesn't show up until this film in particular.
Right. And in the original novella, it's a reveal in the last few pages that they're the same person.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Jekyll
that
and
sounds
Hyde,
about right.
they save that till the end, but I can see why that changed for the play and for this. Could you imagine trying to do a 2-hour version of Jekyll and Hyde where you don't know till the very end that they're the same person? I think that
would be more impossible in a stage production. If they went in a time machine and saw the usual suspects, maybe they could have done something. But otherwise, yeah.
This already had a life on stage. It wasn't like people didn't know about it, but still in 1928 or 29, if MGM would have or Paramount would have made this because of the Hays Code. But now it's like, screw Hays Code. We are going to make this. And I think think it works. The sexual pathology here is actually disturbing. We are dealing with actual sexual assault. That's the thing. On one level, you're like, well, wait, it's Jekyll and Hyde. They're not even that different. What's the big deal? But then the way he is with Ivy makes all the difference. He's creepy and more than creepy. I mean, this is assault. This is beyond what Dracula, I mean, Dracula does, he bites people, and I know Frankenstein's monster throws a kid in a lake. This is worse. Watching it, I'm actually like, I hope these scenes end soon because I don't want him to assault her, and he is, and it's
Hmm.
creepy as hell. Anything else about the production before I talk about the plot? So you go ahead, Kieron. What else did I miss?
We could either talk about the techniques of the movie before the plot or afterwards, sort of up to you.
Why don't we do that after?
Let's
Mamoulian does a
definitely do
lot of
that.
good. I kind of love his. This is a very dexterously made movie. The edits are
Hmm.
fascinating. And really, I mean, as much as Carl Dreyer, he's at least Mamoulian's trying things, and I love him for that. That makes the movie good, I think, in many ways. Why don't I mention some? Well, you know what? I'm going to mention them as I go a little bit. So why don't we just jump in? I may not always pronounce Dr. Jekyll the way they do in the movie. I hope you'll forgive me. The movie opens with an iris enclosed 4-minute POV shot of a man whose attention is diverted from his home organ by his butler pool, prompting him past a mirror that earns a long look so we can see the actor, which is already impressively done, and into a horse-drawn buggy that arrives at a university whose students say, "Good morning, Dr. Jekyll." The shot ends on chattering audience members watching Dr. Jekyll, who we see lecturing on his experiments that prove the duality of man, part good and part evil. In a Victorian children's ward, Jekyll takes away a girl's crutches by successfully encouraging her to walk. In a charity ward, Jekyll insists on performing a surgery himself. Clever edits, Kieron, move us from the ward to a parlor where Jekyll's beau, Muriel, learns of his lateness, and from parlor to a palatial dance floor where the post-surgery Jekyll shows up, dances with Muriel, takes her out to the garden, and declares his love in increasingly close shots. I mean, we're getting into the eyes here. The eyes are filling up the frame. After the party, Muriel's father, a haughty general, refuses Jekyll's urgent request to marry Muriel immediately. Walking home at night with his science-skeptical friend Lanyon, Jekyll stops an assault and helps into her flat the lower-class victim, Ivy, who seduces and kisses Jekyll to the chagrin of Lanyon, who scolds him on the street in a double exposure shot in Jekyll's smoke-filled lab, no doubt influenced by Metropolis, among other films. Jekyll writes one of those "if I die, I love you" kind of notes to Muriel, ingests a newly concocted potion, slips into a POV shown fast-edited reverie of the film so far, sees his new kind of simian lupine face in the mirror, declares himself free at last, and opens the door to Poole's knocking as normal Jekyll again. He's changed back. After Muriel refuses Jekyll's entreaties for a secret marriage and goes to Bath for a month, Jekyll consumes the potion again, transforms into beastly Mr. Hyde, walks in rain-drenched London, gets a tip from Ivy's landlady, bullies people at the Variety Music Hall, and calls over Ivy, who doesn't know this ugly brute, and this brute insists upon loving her in creepier close-ups. Poole tells Lanyon Jekyll is lately itinerant, though a news article mentions Muriel returning from Bath. Mr. Hyde enters Ivy's flat, chases away her landlady, assaults Ivy, forces her to sing in tears, and says he's going away for a few days, but if she missteps while he's gone, quote, "I'll show you what horror means." Later at Ivy's flat, Poole delivers Ivy 50 pounds, prompting the landlady to push Ivy to see her famous benefactor, Dr. Jekyll. Despite the general's opinion that Jekyll is too erratic, Muriel and Jekyll persuade him to consent to a wedding 1 month hence. When Ivy visits Jekyll, she returns the 50 pounds while promising anything to rid her of this inhuman Hyde. He promises she'll never see him again. He lied. In a park, Jekyll watches a cat attack a bird, which causes him to involuntarily transform into Hyde, while party guests await a tardy Jekyll at Ivy's flat. I assume that the production of Friends, the TV show, later used this same flat for their lower
Yeah.
class characters. At Ivy's, Hyde arrives, assaults Ivy, hates Jekyll, and tells Ivy things only Jekyll could know, and things, he says, no one can live after hearing. Hyde murders Ivy with a certain beast-like agility that he also demonstrates when the neighbors break in, and he leaps past them into the misty night streets. Based on Jekyll's flakiness, the general forbids Muriel to marry Jekyll, but she says she loves him. Based on a note Hyde leaves at Lanyon's place, Lanyon gathers a box full of formula from JEKYLL's lab, returns home, waits for midnight, meets a stranger. Contrary to the note, Lanyon pulls a gun on Hyde until he can assure JEKYLL's safety. Left with no choice, in front of Lanyon, Hyde swallows the potion and transforms into JEKYLL and promises Lanyon he'll break up with Muriel before he accidentally hurts her. In what I consider the best acted scene in a sound film up to this point, JEKYLL breaks up with Muriel, his angel of God, while also asking God if he's noticing this penance. Outside of Muriel's terrace, JEKYLL watches her cry, transforms into Hyde, enters, assaults Muriel, beats back the general, escapes into the London streets, outruns many police, goes home, locks the door, races to the lab, transforms back into JEKYLL, and redirects the hapless Bobbies to chase after Hyde. He went that way. It's almost like a Scooby-Doo episode. However, Lanyon arrives and fingers JEKYLL as Hyde, causing an angry JEKYLL to perform back into Hyde and lead the cops around the room until one cop finally shoots him dead as the camera takes in the room from behind a boiling cauldron. Kieron, your thoughts, opinions, feelings about this little movie?
Yeah, this modest little movie. It's definitely my favorite of this group that we're talking about
That's
today,
high
which
praise.
is high praise because all these films are very enjoyable for different reasons. There's a lot to talk about in terms of the technical achievements,
Please.
the ideas, right?
Yes.
The idea of just being trying to get the audience to be from the point of view of JEKYLL throughout the film, especially like with his first transformation. That's all from the point of view as well. Just getting, it's a very unusual getting the audience. I was so emotionally invested in this particular way. I don't think that was done necessarily in other films up until this point as well.
Yes, absolutely.
The technical marvel of the transformation as well.
Yes.
I would say maybe the more elaborate he becomes, the transformations become more sort of what we would imagine sort of transformations for like an older film, like, you know, more traditional sort of camera trickery. I would say like at the beginning of his first transformation, just interesting in itself. It feels like something is really happening without any sort of editing tricks. I was reading about how that was done in particular. I think it's Carl Struess, I think is the cinematographer who
That's right.
he had an interview where he talks about how this was done with particular film stock. So I'm just going to quote here. The first time JEKYLL changed, we used a technique I had devised years before to show the healing of the lepers in Ben-Hur. I guess there was a silent version of Ben-Hur back in 26.
This will be DeMille version.
He says everybody was using orthochromatic film, which produced reds and yellows as black, since everything was in black and white, and gave blue-eyed actors fish eyes. So he did all that. The film that he used was shot in reverse to make the lepers lose their. I had begun using panchromatic film, which is sensitive to all colors. The leprosy spots were red makeup, which registered when shot through a green filter. But when we gradually moved the red filter over the lens, the makeup disappeared. So the Hyde makeup was also in red and didn't show at all when the red filter was on the lens. But when the filter was moved down very slowly to the green, Mr. Hyde appeared. Just how you could see him change, essentially. So it's pretty fascinating to realize that was how it was done, using the benefit of black and white film. Right?
Yes, absolutely. And let's give some credit to Wally Westmore, makeup artist. I just want to say his name, you know, because unlike Lon Chaney, March did not bring his own makeup to set.
Right. Yeah, he was impressive. Of course, let's just say there are certain things, especially involving foam latex. A lot of things involving trying to remove the makeup. There are certain points, especially towards the end, like maybe the last version of Dr. JEKYLL. I think the woman Rose Hebert, who played Muriel, mentioned that trying to take that makeup off led Frederick March having to go to the hospital because they tried different solvents to remove the makeup. It seems like they were sort of experimenting on the fly on this particular actor, which could have been. I don't know, just could have ruined his
career. It could have gone so wrong.
Yeah,
and yet you feel that March is 100% committed.
He's very committed to it.
When he seems in character of a man ingesting this potion to bring out his animal side or whatever it is.
Right. And what's interesting too, especially like after, I think it's even done subtly with his makeup also, like after he basically says, no more, Hyde is no more. And at this point, he delivers the pounds to Ivy, essentially.
Yeah.
And he goes back, he's you can see like literally his face has changed
Yes,
for the worse also already.
right,
Like so there's already like some sort of like permanent sort of let's just say scars because he was basically on a bender in
right.
Bath, if I remember correctly. It's an amazing performance. Most everyone else also matches him. Like
Miriam Hopkins, I love her in Trouble in Paradise, the Ernst Lubitsch
yes,
film. I think, and she's great in this. Yeah,
yeah.
and I guess this film became known for how sexual she was and how you almost see something. You see more than you would in the postcode in the after
Oh,
her.
very much so. Every time I see that scene, I think there's going to be some sort of slip up.
And she's great. I mean, she's a rare one. You can almost feel beauty standards changing towards a more Greta Garbo or Louise Brooks, like from the earlier 20s. But in any event, yeah, Hopkins is
Right.
a real talent. Absolutely. Go.
She's a talent. I would say Muriel has the hardest role
She
of being
does.
somebody who
Give
basically
give
is
Rose
just
Hobart credit for taking on a hard role, right?
of just standing by her man no matter what the circumstances. And we can
Right.
talk about how problematic that can be sometimes, not just for characters, but in real life of standing by whatever you're,
Absolutely.
you know.
Absolutely. And by the way,
So,
Rose Hobart, she's going to be the subject of a whole avant-garde film later. It doesn't matter. Anyway,
oh
it's good
yes,
to see her in a relatively normal place doing an acting job. And yes, you're right. It's a thankless role she's playing here. Yeah, for sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
And you see the parallel of their particular skill sets also, because we mentioned that Jekyll has that great organ that he plays that particular sonata in.
Doesn't
And
that
then,
feel a little Phantom inspired? I mean, I
yes,
don't know.
just a
Yeah,
little bit.
right.
But
Just
then
a
we
little.
also see that player as well. So one thing that's been talked about as well that's interesting is the class system in terms of how the wealthy are sort of
Yep.
preying upon the lower classes, and also maybe not nice things about eugenics
Mm,
in
yeah.
terms of like basically what the idea that we have to talk about our genetic makeup in terms of how taking
Mm.
care of it,
Yes,
right?
and this is a time when
Uh,
eugenics was absolutely considered correct,
this has been
scary.
going on like it started back in the 19th century, right? Yeah. So then talking about weak-minded classes essentially, right?
Yep.
And it's interesting to see like it's hard to know, but one can make some sort of inferences based on a 90-year-old film about what they
Sure.
were saying about the classes and what they were saying about whether the beast in Hyde is something that also is a representative of what the lower classes and what they're like, you could say. So that's something that, it's an interesting thing to sort of ponder that they might be touching upon, however, unintentionally in the film, based on what's going on at the time.
I agree. This is a time when Sigmund Freud is still alive. Do we think that every person is really like an id and a superego or something like their animal side, Apollo and Dionysus? I think what's great about this movie is it knows that, and it's also trying to play around with it. This guy is not a good person,
He starts out as an honorable person. He works at the free clinic,
Yeah.
spending a lot
Well,
of his time
exactly,
helping out
right.
people. His soon-to-be father-in-law, who never becomes his father-in-law,
Sure.
basically, talks about, what a waste, not a waste, but basically just saying, he really shouldn't be spending all of his time doing those sorts of things, essentially.
Yep.
Yeah, and
There
just little
is,
touches like
it
that.
goes back to that theme of sexual frustration. And there's a lot of that. We see it in The Unknown. We see it here where, like, if you don't let a man marry, then it's almost like the movie. I don't want to say it blames the general for, like, him turning into Hyde, but it's not quite that simple. But it's like, I don't know.
There are just long-standing things that were part of Dr. Jekyll's makeup that he didn't really know until his experiment let it all out.
Right. What do you think of all those POV shots and the irises and stuff? I guess that is for you, Kieran, underlining that we're all like Jekyll and Hyde waiting to come out. Is that what Mamoulian's doing with those?
It's hard to know whether it's just wanting us to just sort of getting into the mind of Dr. Jekyll, just sort of,
Sure.
instead of just, I think that he's just playing with the medium of film. I think there's
Yeah,
a lot of
you're right.
experimenting,
And
right?
all those
So,
split screen edits, start
right.
here and what are those? Those are fun. I love them. They remind us that there's a whole story going on all the time. Different people are part of this at different times.
And then there's also the idea of a split personality, obviously,
Well,
right,
oh, thank
too,
you.
and
See, there you
the
go.
split
Right. I
story
guess
that's
that's
going
really
on.
what it is, isn't it? Is that,
But
yeah,
what's interesting is that it's not a vertical wipe or horizontal wipe; it's a diagonal wipe as well. So I was
which
trying to figure out if
that
there
I
was.
thought maybe is supposed to emphasize the clock, like the time is
Mm,
running out on Jekyll and Hyde. This can't continue forever. And I thought, to me, it felt clockish, that clock wipe. But I don't know. Maybe that's not.
yeah, that makes sense. But I really like this film an awful lot. It's odd that it's not streaming anywhere in particular. It's always done well when it's been re-released, but I know there were extra minutes not part of the original and subsequent screenings until they got put on DVD or Blu-ray
Right.
essentially years ago. A lot of things were left out in the cold that people didn't really know about those scenes until they got put out on
Well,
DVD
one
essentially.
kind of horrific postscript, if we're going to talk about what horror means, is MGM wanted to remake the movie 10 years later with Spencer Tracy. They bought the negative, they bought actually the negative, they bought the
Hmm.
rights, they bought the old John Barrymore, and they tried to destroy all prints of the Barrymore version and this version. So we're kind of lucky. So this was actually considered a lost film for decades. According to one source, Spencer Tracy's 1941 version was not so well received, and Frederick March sent Tracy a note thanks
Yeah,
for reviving my career because
exactly.
and that might be one of the reasons Frederick March was offered the lead in The Best Years of Our Lives, which was the #1 film of the 1940s. March won a very well deserved Best Actor Oscar
Mhm.
for a great film, The Best Years of Our Lives, which has nothing to do with horror, but in a weird way, one thing might have led to another.
Right. With that remake, also, it's also famous about Spencer Tracy saying, "Please, no makeup for me."
You're
Um,
right. Well, maybe he had
right.
heard about March's near death
Yeah, he might have
experiences
heard
and
about that as well.
didn't want to rush off to the hospital like Alonzo the Irish.
Exactly. If I remember correctly, that film also made Ingrid Bergman even more
Right.
well known
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
Miriam Hopkins
Right.
role.
She was
So
just fresh off the boat, like Joan Crawford.
exactly.
When you get a good actor, it definitely helps your movie later. Anything else? I feel like you've covered it.
I think
Anything
we've
else?
covered everything. Do what you can to try to see this. I showed you different ways to view this film.
Thank God we now have some of these films that were for years considered lost. We're very lucky to live in our era now when,
Hmm.
they have tracked down versions of these.
Right.
Okay, I'll just do a very quick intro to Vampyr. As we said, we've already kind of mentioned that the stage play of Dracula, that started as Stoker's Widows, sort of, well, I have to earn back the rights because of Nosferatu. I've got to sue. I've got to make sure that more of these versions of Nosferatu don't pop up. So there was already things happening, and then that play did well. Dreyer didn't want to directly make Dracula. He had his own ideas of vampire legends, of what he could do. Passion of Joan of Arc was well received. It was just the timing of it was a little, not perfect because everybody, even in Europe, wanted a sound film. So that's why Joan of Arc maybe didn't do quite as well at the box office as it might have if it had been released a couple years earlier. But in any event, if you watch Passion of Joan of Arc, that's a movie that clearly is one of the great films ever made, often considered one of the 10 best films ever made. It's really something very special. Dreyer had a lot of options of what he could make. He didn't know how to make a sound film. He traveled to England to see what they were doing with the new technology. He spent time on sets. While he was there, he also saw the Dracula play. He kind of based this on In a Glass Darkly a little bit. According to what I read, he read like 30 different vampires. I think he read every extant vampire story that there even was. I guess I believe that Dreyer did a lot of, I don't know if you want to call that research. It's not the same as Hexen research. It's
Right.
just like, okay, what can I do that would be original or interesting enough once I've decided to do this? And
Right. And he was
um,
unfamiliar, basically,
he
right?
was
With
unfamiliar,
the
right? Are you saying, Kieran, that he became familiar?
yes.
Okay. Anyway, I guess there was a movie Camilla, which was a lesbian vampire story. I sort of wish Dreyer had tried harder to make that.
That particular story has been made into a bunch of other films
Okay.
since then. So,
Right. Anyway, a few things, and then he put them together. He wasn't even going to call it Vampyr. It was going to be like there's an article in a magazine in 31 that calls it The Strange Case of Alan Gray or
which
some
is
title.
the main character. Yeah.
That's the main character,
Yeah.
right? And then, but
That's
they
the main character's
eventually
name. Yeah.
decided on a more commercial name, Vampyr. It's an interesting film. He was working in France at the time, in case you're wondering. I think that's right, because of Joan of Arc. He was under good relations with them.
He was trying to, this film was self-produced because of the not as big of a success with Joan of Arc. So he wasn't going to go to any sound stages or anything like that. So he had to
Yes.
go and find places for all
But
location shooting,
isn't that great?
and
It
the
definitely
stories behind how he found things.
it feels very much like he made it in abandoned, weird places that are just sort of found. But I like that
Yes,
about it. And it doesn't have that set bound thing. I mean, I love Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It does definitely feel like it's on set.
yeah.
Even when you're out in the streets of London, it's a very set London.
I think the park is the only sort of like outdoor sort of
I guess when
spot
he
for
sees
that.
that cat, yeah.
Yeah,
But mostly it's
the
movie.
opposite for
This
Vampyr.
movie almost reminds me of some of the better Tarkovsky films. When you're watching Tarkovsky, like Mirror or Solaris, when the characters are walking around parts of Russia and you're like,
Right.
what is this? I get that feeling when I'm watching Vampyr in a great way. I assume Tarkovsky watched this and took notes, but not just that. You could name other weird organic horror movies, like a Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where you feel like you're there. It doesn't feel like,
Right.
Yeah. This
There are
before I
some other
jump into the
things
plot.
like whether some of the plot elements and names
Yeah.
involved in the movie might have had to do with autobiographical things going on in Carl Dreyer's
Fire's
personal
life,
life as
yeah.
well.
Right.
So it was interesting
Yeah.
to read about that as well.
Yeah,
So
this movie definitely has those autobiographical kind of like with Browning is one of the credited writers of The Unknown, and we know that. We know that Dreyer was using stories, but he definitely had some parts of himself in this. I mean, that you feel that. All
so
right,
before you
go ahead.
also like
Yeah,
you
please.
can before you go there, I ask a favor to go use the bathroom.
I'll edit this.
Just
Go
do
ahead.
that.
The first card says Alan Gray studied devil worship and vampires until one day he came to the village, Courtempiere. A masked man bearing a large scythe rings a riverside bell that calls a raft, watched by the traveling Gray checking into an inn where he hears weird muffled voices and locks his room's door before he sees a disfigured man. A card says that night, Gray felt odd terrors. Morning, Gray sleeps, hears a knock, sees his private room's door open, and watches as an older man enters, tells him she mustn't die, writes, to be opened upon my death on a package, and leaves. A card says Gray could feel, quote, a soul in mortal distress was crying out for help, unquote. In late afternoon, Gray leaves the inn, moves along the small river, walks around an abandoned estate, and follows the shadow of an apparent peg-legged gardener or gravedigger or soldier whose shadow joins him on a bench. As Gray looks right, the camera pans across shadows of partygoers and musicians before arriving at a barn perch where down below an old woman is seen yelling, "Silence." It reminded me of David Lynch later. Gray emerges from a trap door as the camera pans over an open casket full of, we don't know yet, maybe banana peels, ribbons, ties. By now, the camera, editing, and sound have proven unreliable or incongruous at the very least, Kieron. Gray watches an Einsteinish man walking downstairs who says, "Did you hear that?" but rejects Gray's ideas of noises of children or dogs. We haven't heard those either. Einstein man, who is a doctor, bids Gray good night, walks near a rather animated skull, and brings out an old woman who hands him a bottle of poison that he readies for a caged bird. We see Gray in a wood following shadows, maybe of Wayang Golek. That is the name of Indonesian two-dimensional puppets. Just before a card says that Gray found a manor where his room's visitor lived with his daughters and servants. Bearing a candelabra, visitor man visits his bedridden adult daughter, proclaims her wounds nearly healed, sees her convulse, and warns the attending nun not to sleep until the doctor arrives. After visitor man collapses, Gray convinces a caretaker to let him enter and spoon feeds some kind of white powder to the fallen man, who smiles to see his daughter out of bed just before he dies. The nun comforts the stunned daughter and asks Gray to stay. A caretaker, behaving oddly, gets a horse from the barn and leaves in a carriage. Gray tells the daughter he's only going to the police. Gray opens the package the man had marked earlier, and it turns out to be an instructional manual about vampires. The first page mentions the full moon, grave rising, blood sucking, youth targeting, life prolonging, and the Prince of Darkness, Kieron. The next page calls a vampire bite a mark of damnation. The daughter calls out Leonie and runs outside. She and Gray find Leonie lying near death on a bench before servants carry her inside. Gray returns to the book, which uses words like plague, repulsion, curse, and, quote, to seek its own prey among those nearest and dearest, unquote. Leonie awakens, cries, tells her sister, "If only I could die." Scares off her sister, who goes to the next room to tell Gray that Leonie is dying. As the carriage returns, its driver collapses and Gray sees blood below his head. Gray reads a new page that tells how a doctor became a vampire's henchman. Our doctor arrives, returns Gray's awkward Guten Abend, and examines the holes on Leonie's neck, but much of this is told elliptically with shadows and noises and indirect angles. The movie's clearly trying to be a little bit less than completely literal. The doctor asks Gray for blood for Leonie, saying, "Come on, young man." And Gray agrees. As Leonie's sister asks the nun why the doctor always comes at night, a page of the book says vampires prefer that their victims commit suicide so that their soul goes to the evil one. Caretaker reads a page in the vampire manual about how they must be killed despite no sure method of doing so, although it cites an iron stake that killed one and even broke her curse on her victims. A vampire who may or may not be the monstrous Marguerite Chopin of Courtempiere. Gray complains of losing blood, falls asleep, dreams of a skeleton holding a poison, gets awoken by the caretaker, jumps up, pushes aside the doctor, saves Leonie from poisoning herself, and runs outside to find where the doctor may have gone. Leonie tells the nun she's afraid to die because she's damned. Outside on a bench, Gray becomes a double exposure, and one of his diaphanous selves returns to the abandoned estate and sees a gravestone saying, quote, "Of dust thou art, and to dust thou shalt return," unquote. Gray's ghostly self sees a person in a coffin and Leonie's sister trapped in a room, but Gray can't open the door, maybe because he's a ghost. As the doctor and his peg leg assistant move a few things around, Gray goes back into the open trapdoor. He is soon trapped in the coffin with only a window made to reveal his head. We see his point of view as the doctor and assistant carry him in the coffin to the graveyard. There, the caretaker begins desecrating a grave, assisted by Gray's other bench self, who seems more solid. In the grave is the old woman whom we had seen in the birdcage scene. The caretaker drives a stake into the heart of this woman, which turns her into a skeleton and makes Leonie sit up in bed and declare her strength. She seems cured by this. Meanwhile, the doctor smokes and his peg-legged assistant plays banjo at the abandoned estate as thunder and lightning rumble outside. A man's face takes up an entire door-sized window, scaring the assistant enough to make him fall downstairs to his death. Gray unties the sister, gets in a small boat with her, and rows them across a misty river. I love the use of mist in these movies. The doctor hides in the granary of a mill, but his assistant, perhaps reanimated or assisted by a spirit, activates the gears and fills the granary with flour, suffocating the cursing doctor. Gray and the sister get out of the boat, hear or make noises, and walk into a sunlit pastoral. By the way, I keep calling her the sister. The notes on the movie call her JEKYLL. We can use that name for her, but I didn't see that name in the movie itself. It's fine to call her JEKYLL, but just so we both know, the movie gives the viewer no way of knowing that. What do you think of this film, Kieran? Thoughts, feelings, impressions?
Thoughts, feelings, impressions. Let's see. Is this really a film about anything that actually happens, or is this all just a very long dream, essentially? It could be that. And I would be, and just the act of not explaining things in particular, I appreciate about this film also. You will see the term of dream logic is something that is very prevalent in the history of horror cinema, in particular subgenres as well. And in particular decades that dream logic is being used. Also, it's used as a preferential device with certain countries as well, depending on the period, depending on what they're talking about, depending on what the settings of the films are. This setting itself just lends itself to one of, it could be a story that can be told one of two ways. Either it's a very conventional story about the goings on between a particular family and what's befalling them, or a fever dream that involves a particular character who's a surprisingly passive observer of what is going on. It's almost like the director was doing that intentionally because the actor happens to be his main financial backer. So I don't know. I'm sure there's no correlation between that, I would say. So, but I do. Yeah, because of the particular path that Dreyer goes on. One thing involving music, the music in this film is actually particularly good. I was going to say about the music for The Unknown, I would say is kind of a weak point, at least from my version. Also, I don't know, there's something that gets a silent sort of production that you're viewing moving more than, say, a lone piano. When
Yeah.
you have an actual orchestra moving things on, I think we've gotten to the point, and I think younger audiences will probably agree that if there's no dialogue, if you can fill the space with something else musically that would capture the mood of what you're viewing, then that makes up for the lack of dialogue also.
Sure.
What happens in Vampyr, there's a lot more use of sound. You can tell it's a discovery for Carl Dreyer, kind of like how Mamoulian was discovering what he could do with the camera to symbolize certain things in his film. Dreyer feels like there's a lot of, oh, we have to do this today.
Yeah.
Why don't we try this out and see what happens? Maybe this can be used for the film later. We'll just put that on our thinking cap for when we edit the film together and see what happens. It feels like there's a lot of like sort of in the moment discovery in the film also. It seems like the actual plot itself is kind of secondary or tertiary to what is just going on.
Tertiary is good.
The actual mood that you're experiencing.
He's going for mood here as much as anything. I like that on
I do
some
too.
level. It's weird for sure. And that's kind of, I agree with you. The lead character, Gray, he's crossing a river early on that he saw a guy with a scythe crossing. So
Yes.
for all we know, we are in a Greek myth underworld.
Right.
I don't think he wants to rule that out. I think that on some level we're supposed to think that, or it could, at least there's a lot of interpretations he doesn't want to rule out, is what I would get, kind of, more or
Right.
less.
I was trying to remember the painting. There's a painting involving like a man with a scythe as well.
Yeah.
He did mention Dreyer that he was influenced by a lot of the different artists at the time as well. Not in particular one artist, but just the various different movements that were going on at the time, because the 20s was a particularly fertile time. So you can see that because of that, there are certain shots and other things that kind of ate particular paintings as well, especially like even the last scene with them just sort of going off into the light.
Yes, absolutely. I think Jean Epstein could be considered somebody reacting to some degree with not just with the fall of the House of Usher, but also other movies. We talked about that on the E-List podcast, and the fall of the house. And I think German expressionism, I mean, sure, even though Dreyer claimed he'd never seen Nosferatu, I don't quite believe that. And just in general, I mean, yeah, and what had been done and what was still left to be done, I think Dreyer was definitely going for certain things, being able to, play around with dream logic for various ways. And I think that's, yeah, and it's an authentically kind of creepy, it makes the ordinary extraordinary and vice versa. I can see why so many reviewers have loved this, especially in retrospect. It gives off an authentically creepy vibe, even when you're in the middle of, and I think that it can be hard to make nature strange, but this succeeds.
Yeah, a few things. Because he is sort of, I think because he was kind of enveloping himself in as many different variations on theme or different tellings of what vampires are, he doesn't feel wedded to necessarily. Well, also there's talk about the timing of whether he actually could have seen the play of Dracula possibly, but he wouldn't have seen the movie at that point because the film was shot in 1930 before.
No, that's absolutely right. Yes, they were being filmed around the same time, actually.
Yeah, exactly. So the actual vampire myth, in terms of how it moved from sort of like a folkloric idea of just sort of people in your family, very sort of working class almost, to becoming something of like an aristocrat later on that was preying on the lower classes.
Wow, I love this theme we've got going on.
Yeah, it's interesting that he sort of is going back towards something more folkloric in his portrayal of who the vampire is.
Yeah.
At this point, for quite a while longer, if there was any sort of female vampire, there were younger female vampires under the spell of the main one. The exception being
the type of vamp that came.
There was the vamp, of course, and then the exception, sort of one-off, would be Dracula's daughter later on. But yeah, it's interesting him being just a regular old woman who happens to be this vampire also.
I like that. To me, that's almost a feminist statement by the standards of the time.
Right. It's also funny how everyone around the main character has an idea of what is going on and is doing all the work to move the plot along, which we've already talked about how passive the main character is.
He really is us, isn't he? I mean, Gray just is us. He's just us.
Yes. Maybe his last name, Gray, is sort of a clue. From what I understand, There's definitely been a little bit of excision with some of the film, including the deaths, the staking, and the death of the doctor. Apparently, from what I saw, they were a little bit more brutal or prolonged in the original cuts.
Yeah.
And I know that
Yeah.
he had some issues with reactions to the film that led him to cut a lot of things drastically. He seemed to sort
There,
of like
there,
react to
yeah.
the feedback in the sort of the
Yeah.
same way they sort of react to how he was making the film and how things happened or he made discoveries along the way. Maybe the editing portion was him making reactionary cuts to the films based on what the audiences were saying.
In all four of these movies, there's a theme of me wanting more blood and more explicit deaths. I mean, like
Yes.
when Jekyll kills Ivy, I'm like, come on, I want to see this. And yeah, here I know what you mean. On the other hand, I loved, apropos of The Unknown, they did put gauze on the lens for the camera,
Yes.
much like they did in The Unknown, although it's better in this one. In Vampyr, unlike with Unknown, you can't really see it, but they did, apparently they put black netting. I'm going on a BFI article.
Right. This made me think of a burlap sack,
Yep.
practically.
Yeah, that's right. And they reflected light onto it with
Mm.
mirrors. It's cool that Carl Dreyer is trying weird stuff using, yeah, I don't know. I love that you point out the music. There's a bunch of interesting little choices here. Horror filmmakers could do worse than to crib from this, and I'm sure they occasionally did.
With a film that's ethereal and dreamlike like this, and that's also silent, you sort of wonder with a modern audience whether the
Right.
pace could be faster for them, I suppose. But that's about the only thing I could see
Too
newer
close,
audiences.
isn't it? To like it feels like one of those silent slash sound. I mean, we've
Yeah,
seen other
it's a
films from that
very
time. I mean, and by 1930, when they're filming this, he should know there's no way there's going to be any more silent films. He put all the sound in post production. They had to dub all the actors later, etc. You know, he was still so. Yeah, I don't know,
right. They
but
were
it does.
dubbing,
Yeah.
if I remember correctly, they were because everyone was speaking different languages
Well,
too, if I remember
they had
correctly, right?
three
So
different versions apparently. There's a German, there's a French,
the
and an
French,
English.
and then
Right,
there's
but
I think they tried to do a Danish version as
Oh,
well.
did
I
they
don't
try
remember if it
that?
was
That
they
I didn't
tried
know.
that, but I don't know
Okay.
if it got completed, or
Yeah.
maybe it was the English version that didn't get completed. I think one of those two versions. There's like an extra version that didn't get completed for different
Okay.
reasons. Yeah,
Anything
that's it.
else before I move to the fourth film? I'm trying to schedule
Well,
this.
the
Go ahead.
reaction of the film was such that he might have like checked himself into a sanitarium later, if I remember correctly.
Saying
And
Carl Dreyer might have gone.
that did happen. And if I remember correctly, the
Wow.
sanitarium also was called the Jeanne d'Arc Cemetery over
Oh,
in
oh,
Paris.
that's
Yeah.
hilarious.
Yeah.
But also terrible. When life imitates art, that's a little nutty, isn't it? When it comes to the horror genre, we don't really want life to imitate art usually.
No.
That is quite the postscript. Carl Dreyer made few films, especially of all the major world directors. He took his time following up Joan of Arc with this. And then after, I don't even know how many movies he's made after Vampyr. I want to say three, four. It's not.
Yeah, very few of them. Yeah, he had
And this is
a long
over the
time.
course of decades. He really,
Hmm.
when these audiences aren't as appreciative as they should be, maybe that's the time to stab them in the back.
So it's the history of art and when it's
Yes.
appreciated and reappreciated or looked at with different eyes, depending on whatever decade it gets looked at as well, depending on what's going on
Sure.
at the time. It's always the same. There's new appreciation or new consternation about a film, depending on what
Yeah.
people are going through at the time when they see it.
Are we ready to go to our fourth and final film of the day? Are you feeling
Oh,
ready
yeah.
for that? This next movie, our last movie of the day, Carl Laemmle did have something to do with it. We've been talking about Dracula, and we should be. I mean, also, another movie that gets deserved to be mentioned here is M, the Fritz Lang film, 1931, about a serial killer. So, the thing was that a lot of things were happening. Sound had come in, the Depression had come in. The German film industry was kind of screwed in a way. They didn't have the money to put together another Metropolis or anything close to that. So they had to scale back. And a lot of those filmmakers came over to America anyway. A lot of the really good ones, they followed Ernst Lubitsch over here, like von Sternberg and others. So they were making their own things. Not everybody was interested in horror. But honestly, I don't think Carl Laemmle expected Dracula to be quite the hit that it was once he negotiated for the rights. Again, that was made in that fever of them needing any kind of hit. They didn't know how good Bela Lugosi would be. They didn't know. I mean, they knew him from the stage. They tried to get somebody else to play that role. But once it was a smash hit, they were like, oh, okay, what can we use these sets for? Oh, let's make Frankenstein. We got the old Mary Shelley book lying around here. So they did that. That was also a hit. After that became a hit, it became, okay, we got Boris Karloff under contract. What are we going to do with him? Karloff himself didn't necessarily want to talk. We talked about this with Bride of Frankenstein. He argued with Lemley. He was like, I don't think the character of Frankenstein's monster should speak in Bride of Frankenstein. That
Right.
hurts him. And Lemley was like, no, no, you're talking. You're under contract. Shut up and speak. Almost like shut up and dribble, LeBron James. But one reason Karloff could even say that, I think Karloff sort of saw himself a little bit like Lon Chaney, that he could act with his face and do that. And so I don't think he was sad that the next project after Frankenstein was The Old Dark House. I think that was fun for him to be able to play this kind of lunatic, but also with a soul.
It's not like he didn't have a long career of being a regular working actor up
Right.
until Frankenstein. So he had been in scores of films already at this point with a variety of characters. So it's not like he necessarily had to worry about his ego necessarily, about I should be speaking all the time necessarily, right? So
that's part of it, right? I also think him and James Whale, they had put something together well with Frankenstein. They knew each other. I don't think they were necessarily thinking we're going to make art here. I think it was more like, okay, here's one project that we can kind of riff on. The Agatha Christie thing was already becoming a little bit of a thing of like murder in a house, people trapped in a house, or something like that, like, and
right.
let's
That
riff
film
on
Cat in the
that.
Canary is what you're thinking of, right?
There you go. Thank you. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Yes, you're right. And there was a novel, Benighted, from 1927 that this is, I guess, directly based on.
Right. It's a J.B. Priestley novel.
J.B.
Yeah.
Priestley, right. I haven't read it.
I've heard it's
Right.
quite a little bit different.
It's supposed to be different, but so supposedly what they did, at least what I read, is that they opened it up and made it a little funnier. Certainly Charles Lawton's character is almost like comedy relief, which is not something you always associate with later Lawton roles. But he's fun. I mean, the minute he shows up, you're like, this is kind of what we needed, a little bit of relief. You could argue that in general, the Penderel character is more fun than you might expect him to be. So you could see why Lemley made this project. Universal is not quite yet the house of horror, but it's kind of going that way. Now, this is right at the time when Lemley's like, wait a second, we just got known for Dracula and Frankenstein. Maybe this is a bit of a gold mine here. Maybe we can start being known as that studio. Because at the time, Universal had either no reputation or not much, or a sort of a B-row reputation or whatever it was. So this could actually work out for them. Is there anything else I want to say about the pre-production here?
I don't have a lot of
Pretty straightforward, right? They knew what
made.
they were doing. It's definitely made in Hollywood, although it's set in Wales and stars a bunch of British actors mostly. The rain that I've been hearing this whole podcast has kind of been setting up this whole thing.
The rain has been sort of just waiting in the wings for us to mention it, basically, saying I'm right here.
The Old Dark House begins in a torrential downpour on a rural Welsh road as Margaret argues with her husband Philip, who is driving them lost. The camera pans right to reveal their friend, Mr. Penderel, who says he doesn't really care where they end up. Then he sees a dark house he feels they should skip. However, the fact that their car is driving right to left through a veritable river and landslide forces them to stop, park, and bang on the dark house's front door so loudly, as Penderel jokes, that they could have raised the dead. A bearded, scarred man answers, mutters, and waves them in as they request shelter for the night. A sort of classic patrician English gentleman introduces himself as Horace Fem, gets their names, explains that Morgan is dumb, that's his word, throws his sister's flowers in the burning walk-in fireplace, and introduces his gypsy-ish half-deaf sister, Rebecca, who refuses them shelter and everything else. Horace overrules Rebecca, lets them move the car to the stables, allows them to bring in bags, offers gin, and worries that if they get shut in, Morgan might freak out. In a bedroom that Margaret has requested for changing her clothes, Rebecca compares Margaret to her young, sinful, and dead sister, warns of her sinful 102-year-old father, and inveighs against sin as the mirror shows Rebecca's warped reflection that Margaret reflects upon privately just before she opens a window that blows in more windy rain. With Margaret returned dressed for dinner, the Hems convene supper, whereby Rebecca insults her brother's blessings, makes her own, and orders Morgan to help serve the roast beef, potatoes, and pickled onions. A new knock heralds the arrival of informal Gladys Duquesne and jolly William Porterhouse, who join the others for dinner. Smash cut to 2 hours later when William reveals his materialist love for his dead wife, and Gladys reveals her lower class status. Pendrell privately tells Gladys he can go to the car for whiskey, and she insists on coming with. Although the front door slams on her and Morgan reaches for her by breaking open a window. Back in the main room as lights flicker, Horace tells the other guests that only Morgan understands their lights and he's now too drunk. At William and Rebecca's prompting, Horace and Philip ascend stairs to bring down a lamp, but when the two are alone, they hear maniacal laughter and Horace refuses to carry on, leaving Philip to ascend, pick up the lamp, and notice a bolted door next to a plate of half-eaten food, Kieron. When Rebecca complains about her open window, William goes with her to close it. Margaret makes shadow puppets, freaks, opens the front door, and calls to Gladys and Pendrell. Morgan closes the front door, keeps Margaret inside, chases her around the room, follows her up the stairs, and fights with Philip, who eventually uses the lamp to knock Morgan cold and down the stairs. In the dry car, Pendrell and Gladys drink, bond, flirt, kiss, and return to the house where their knocking arouses a napping William, only for him to learn that they're in love. Philip and Margaret meet the bedridden centenarian Roderick, who warns of the house's dangers and madness, particularly if Morgan frees Saul, who once tried to burn the house down. Horace warns the guests to kill Saul before locking himself in his own room. The 5 guests gather in the main room as Morgan comes down the stairs and lunges at Margaret, causing the 3 men to hold and drag him into a hallway at Rebecca's prompting. After Pendrell returns to the main room, Rebecca offers sanctuary to Gladys and Margaret, but when they refuse, she locks that hall door. Pendrell hustles the 2 guest women into a closet off the main room as he confronts Saul, who says he's innocent. Morgan beats him and the family traps him because he knows they killed Rachel. Saul finds a knife, makes Pendrell sick, compares himself to biblical Saul, and eventually fights and knocks out Pendrell near the fire. Pendrell awakens moments later to see Saul up the stairs on an extended balcony-like landing using kindling to light curtains. As Pendrell fights him and tries to extinguish the fire, they both fall from the landing into the main room, which knocks them out. Morgan breaks into the main room, opens the closet, prevents the young women from going to Pendrell, pushes Pendrell aside, cries at Saul's injuries, picks up Saul, and bears him up the stairs. William and Philip finally break in and tend to their women and a barely living Pendrell. Cut, Kieron, to a storm-free morning where Philip and Margaret dash off. Rebecca harumphs. Horace coordinates, and Pendrell awakens and proposes to a clearly smitten Gladys. Okay, Kieron, that's our final film summary of the day. What did you think of this movie?
I like this film quite a bit. I wouldn't say it's necessarily horrific. There are certain horrific
Right.
characters. The play that happens between someone who is physically imposing and monstrous to look at and does monstrous things in a clearly monstrous way is interesting when they show who the real monster of the house is. He
Yes.
appears to be a very genteel, innocent older man who obviously wouldn't hurt a fly, let's just say. When we find out that that's absolutely not the case. I do like how the film plays off of those 2 characters because of that. There's some interesting things to talk about in terms of the family itself being sort of at war with itself and at war with religion, in terms of how some members are extreme believers and there's one non-believer who secretly is kind of terrified of God. The characters find themselves in this house. They vary of like little bits of interest here and there. Some have more to do than others. There's always a very romantic subplot involving someone of lower class and someone untethered after being a World War I veteran. This is probably the first film we sort of talked about that even sort of mentions World War I a little bit in this way, which is interesting. Yeah, in this season. And also just because you could say, and other people have argued in various sources, that the proliferation of the wounded from World War I and the media focus on actual World War I victims, people seeing them in their world became one of the key points. You could say how other people sort of became maybe not so, let's just say not, let's see, what's the best word of saying? They basically weren't the idea of horror, even though it hadn't become horror and the definition wasn't horror at that point, but they were, let's just say, more susceptible. Maybe susceptible is maybe not the right word, but they were more receptive to the idea because of,
Yeah.
what World War One had wrought essentially
Yeah.
after the World War
Yeah.
One was over. So
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's the lost generation here. You vibe that. I think that the play is supposedly based on that more,
yes,
but you
yeah.
get that. You can vibe it when you're watching the movie. You sense that, right? There's an emptiness, almost like a nihilism or something. And then when Rebecca is like the sins of the fathers, you're kind of like, okay, it looks like things are still getting a little weirder.
In terms of other coupling, unfortunately, the Raymond Massey, Gloria Stewart characters are kind of like they would be in sort of like a drawing room sort of English
They
comedy,
would,
essentially,
and
if
we're
it
going to
would
see
be.
these types again and again. Well, and maybe not even on this podcast, but just in general. You could argue this movie really set the table for all the future Rocky horrors and Clues and all the other,
Hmm.
really, and there's always got to be that straight couple, supposedly, or not always, but we have them, it's kind of a cliche, you know.
Right. And you know about the connection between Raymond Massey and Boris Karloff later on, right?
No, I don't, please.
Well, remember that well, Arsenic and Old Lace. There's the
Oh,
character
right.
who
Okay.
is supposedly, well, on the stage play was played by Boris Karloff, but in the movie is played
Oh,
by Raymond
wow.
Massey.
That's cool.
So, yeah, and Charles Laughton gets a very compelling sort of backstory that he regales
Yes.
us with as well. Ernest Thesiger, if you just knew him from Bride of Frankenstein, he's
Yeah.
probably my favorite character in the movie. There's not so much gothic sort of horror necessarily, as much experimenting as went on with Jekyll and Hyde and Vampyr in terms of cinematic experimentation. There's not much that goes on
Right.
experimentation wise in Old Dark House, really. There's a little bit with the mirror scene, essentially, with with the sister and with
That
Gloria
part
Stewart,
was cool.
essentially.
It looked the
Like that part is like
refracted
really well
thing.
done. Yeah.
Yes, right. But you're right. It's not trying to be that kind. James Whale, his concerns are elsewhere, is what I would say. James Whale's not
Yes.
interested in doing. I mean, he later with Bride of Frankenstein, he brings in all this German expressionism, especially in
Hmm.
the outdoor scenes. It's great. But in this particular film, he doesn't seem like he cares enough, or whatever it is. Maybe the budget was lower or something.
The house itself is interesting. There's a
Yes, it
lot that
is.
could be done with it. I think
Right.
in later decades,
Yeah,
just kind
yeah.
of a template for a haunted
It
house in
is.
a
It
way.
really is.
And
And
people
the
are,
idea that people are leaving rooms and like leaving other people alone in rooms and like
yes,
what, all that. One thing
yeah.
you mentioned Jekyll and Hyde. I didn't really mention this before, but I like Jekyll and Hyde the occasional fights. I like that
Hmm.
I don't even know if it's always Frederick March. He's leaping to establish his beast-like abilities. Occasionally those fights can look very real, but none of them look more real than the scene where Penderel fights Saul up on the balcony
Yeah.
landing amongst the embers. It looks like there's probably real flame there. Yes, they could have faked the flame, but I bet they didn't. It looks like a fight. It looks like a real fight. Like they're jumping on each. I mean, like it doesn't. You know how like a fake fight. I mean, we've all seen The Godfather when Sonny, played by James Caan, beats up his brother-in-law, and it looks
Right.
so fake. This doesn't look fake. This looks real. Like,
The stunt work
yes.
that Boris Karloff goes through as well is
Yep.
very well done.
Oh, we're
And
talking about when he's chasing after
yeah, when he's
Gloria
chasing after
Stewart.
Gloria Stewart in his
No,
fight with
it
Raymond
looks,
Massey, that's very
yeah,
well done.
no,
In
it
terms
is.
of actor safety, I mean, it's no coincidence that maybe Boris
Right.
Karloff later on was like one of the founders of the Screen Actors Guild later on. So, I'm sure he was thinking about this and other films and the
Sure.
stunt work
It's
and
a
the
really good
safety that he
point.
had to sort of like worry about in the films that he had done in his
It's a
past.
really good
So,
point. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's a lot of this movie. It's chock full of kind of fascinating moments. I think, it's fun. There's every few minutes something happens that you're not really expecting. And either with an actor's performance or something.
I enjoy this film quite a fair amount as well. It's interesting to see this film is like another almost lost film
It
in a
was for a long
because
time.
it is
Lost,
the
right?
template of lost films. This is one of those instances where we can sort of blame William Castle as well,
Yes. Let's blame
because
him
of
when we
his
can.
yeah, because of his remake that played out the comedy even more and
Sure,
bombed
maybe too
critically
much.
as well. But also, I think one of the things that made the Universal horror films endure well beyond their initial run was television. It was either Screen Gems or someone else, like at this point, like in 57 or somewhere around there, sold like a package of Universal horror films to television to broadcast. And that created another generation of monster kids because of that.
Yeah.
But Old Dark House wasn't, it's part of that package, unfortunately.
Interesting. Interesting.
So,
Yeah, I see influence over like the Addams Family, the Munsters. I mean, all
mhm.
kinds of just like whatever, these kinds of things. By the way, did you know that the 102-year-old father sounds like a woman? Did you know it was played by a woman named Elspeth?
Yes,
Wilson?
yeah, I did
Yeah.
know that, especially like watching it a few other times. Her laugh kind of gives it away. Her laugh is
Yeah,
kind of
a
like a
little
crone
bit.
type of laugh, a little bit.
Right. Yeah. I love
Although
your love.
Saul's
Oh,
laugh
go
is a
ahead.
little
Sorry.
bit like that as well too.
Yeah.
So you sort of wonder whether that was intentional as well. What do you think about, was James Whale sort of playing intentionally with the idea of uh, messing around with gender roles also,
Yep.
whether he was doing that intentionally or not?
Right.
So
I guess that's a big part of it. The horror, I mean, you said that this isn't as horror-ish as some, and I agree with that. I think it does establish a lot of tropes. There's a lot of like
mhm.
laughing behind walls or whatever,
Right.
and this idea of a kind of a patrician sort of gothic house where crazy things can happen on a rainy night.
Right,
I
but
love
even
I
then, he also turns the patrician role on its head too, because
oh,
really, it's
right. You
well,
mean Thesiger?
Thessigers doesn't really
Yeah, yeah.
control the house
He
necessarily.
locks himself away for like the main part of the movie for the
Yes,
climax. I'm like, where is he? I guess maybe he's working on creating Frankenstein's monster with Victor Frankenstein somewhere because he's not in this house.
no, definitely
Anyway,
not.
yeah.
So
Anything else that we should comment on before we wrap up on the old dark house?
I think it's just another really solid underseen film. I think that's part of James Whale's that deserves to be seen more by people. And once they see it, they'll sort of connect the dots in terms of all the other cliches. It's always interesting to see like where the cliches in films where they had their start as well. And so
Sure.
and and it's not like they were done badly. They
You
were done
noticed
with
all four of these movies are set in Europe. They're probably set within about a 200-mile radius of each. Well, no, Spain, I guess, is further than 200 miles from Wales. But I kind of think that's not a coincidence that they've held up as well as they have. Hollywood filmmakers at the time were going to Europe for prestige. It made it seem like more cachet or like it could happen to like even prestigious Europeans of the time, And I think
well,
there's,
there's
sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
there's the prestige of that, and there's also just like, basically just the longer shared history of the world in Europe as opposed to what was
Sure,
going on in the US.
true.
Certain ideas of just sort of like Gothic plot elements.
Yeah,
They hadn't
absolutely.
really explored. They explored them much more in Europe, and I think in the U.S. when American films were sort of realizing that that was something to cover, that just made more sense to cover it. It took a while for
Right,
them to start to make quote
right.
unquote American Gothic movies, essentially.
That's absolutely. Horror is about, the past is still alive, coming back to haunt us, and that's kind of what these movies in some ways invoke.
This is the one film from this movie that actually even from one of the films that we're talking about. A lot of those horror films, depending on the time and place of it, even mentions like World War I in
Yeah,
this case,
yeah.
right?
Well, there you go. Right. And
So,
that had to be just, I mean, for Europe especially, that was such a trauma. It was such a, I
mhm.
mean, not that it didn't affect Americans at all, but it was so much more there. I mean, it was like the end of hope and dream in many ways
Yes.
because they just fought over 5 feet of real estate for 4 years between France and Germany and realized that after losing millions of people it meant nothing. So that was
Hmm.
yeah, that's pretty disillusioning. I also think sexual repression is a thing. Michael Stragow points out in this particular for Old Dark House, he uses that phrase that the movie portrays sexual repression as a creeping disease. So we
Right.
see that theme here. Freud is still alive, and people are starting to learn more about repression, the return of the repressed, the fact that we can't really say what we want. This is getting back to Robin Wood's whole thing about every horror movie is about space, like you repress feelings but they have to come out in some way, and I think that
Yeah.
Old Dark House almost literalizes that because Saul is a character coming out of a locked door. And then
Right.
I love that you pointed out the twist of like supposedly Morgan was going to kill him but instead he's actually his tender caretaker. I mean, I think
Right.
what's good about Old Dark House is yes, it has a premise of a bunch of people in a rainy night, but they do toward the end, it's twistier than you expect it to be in terms of what's going to really happen. I know it ends
Right.
with the predictable Pendrell and Gladys getting together. But other than that, it's nice, twisty stuff.
And in terms of Freud, through the four films that we've talked about, will be the ideas of the uncanny,
Yep.
obviously, are
Yep.
going throughout the film.
Absolutely.
The ideas of doubling, literally doubling, especially with Jekyll and Hyde as well, and
Yep.
that's going to be something covered throughout
Yep.
many other films
Yes.
too.
As we get further into the sound era, there'll be less dubbing and more doubling. Gloria Stewart not looking anything like her Titanic self. Wait, doesn't she look just like Kate Winslet? Oh, I guess not. All right. Well, I think it might be about time to wrap up. Any
Okay.
last thoughts about these movies?
No last thoughts. Glad that we covered them in this particular episode. Looking forward to the next one.
Well, now that you've set me up, I can't help but tell the lovely viewers or listeners what the next foursome is going to be, and that is going to be an interesting group here. The Mummy, The Invisible Man, The Black Cat, and Mad Love. Those four. And we will talk about movies like Bride of Frankenstein and things that were also happening at the time. Okay, Kieron, I think we rocked this. Thank you. And this was fun, and I look forward to next week.
Yes.
And save me some popcorn because there's always another movie to see.